So I thought I would come on and read you a bedtime story out of my big book. So welcome to True Crime at Bedtime, where we're going to dive into some real life crime cases as we settle in for the night. Not all bedtime stories are supposed to comfort, so turn off the light, pull up the covers, and let's get started on tonight's story. But first, disclaimer. This video is intended for mature audiences. Content in this video is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. All information provided is based on publicly available sources. Some content in this video may be disturbing or graphic for certain viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. So let's open the book of bedtime stories and see what tonight's story is. Ooh, the Axeman of New Orleans. Between 1918 and 1919, the vibrant city of New Orleans was plunged into terror by a shadowy figure known only as the Axeman. In the early 1900s, New Orleans was a bustling, culturally rich city. This diversity made it a very unique place, but it also created a divided society with class and racial tensions simmering just beneath the surface. At the time, New Orleans was one of the busiest port cities in America. The Mississippi River served as a gateway for trade and commerce, bringing in goods and people from all around the world. But what defined New Orleans most in the early 1900s was its music. This was the birthplace of jazz. It wasn't just entertainment. It was the heartbeat of the city. It could be heard in the streets, the clubs, and the homes of the city's working class. The music reflected the soul of New Orleans, improvisational, rebellious, and full of life. As the music of New Orleans grew louder, so did its underworld. The early 1900s saw an influx of Italian immigrants who settled into neighbourhoods like the French Quarter and brought with them their own customs and communities. However, it wasn't long before organised crime found its way into the city. The Black Hand, an early form of Italian mafia, preyed on local businesses, demanding protection money. The authorities were often powerless, or worse, complicit. It was a time where the line between the law and the lawless was often blurred. Among all the hustle, jazz and crime, the streets held a much darker secret, one that would send shockwaves throughout the city, when every shadow in the night took a darker form, a form that was silent, unseen and unstoppable. Joseph and Catherine Maggio were a hard-working Italian couple who ran a grocery store on the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Street. They lived in a small apartment at the back of the store, as many grocers did at the time. In the dead of night, on May 23, 1918, a man chiselled away the bottom panel of the back door to their home and then crept inside. He first slit Joseph's throat with a straight razor. This wound, however, was not immediately fatal. He then did the same to Catherine, whose injuries would be much more severe. He then beat them both with an axe that he found inside their home. There are two different ideas as to why he did this. The first is that he was trying to make it harder for police to figure out the cause of death, slowing them down. Or a second reason, that he was just that twisted that he wasn't done having his fun and thought, why not give their axe a go? Their bodies were found the next morning by Joseph's brothers, Jake and Andrew, around 4:30 a.m, 2 hours after the attack. They lived next door to the Maggios and yet somehow didn't hear the attack happening. If you think this sounds suspicious, the police thought so as well. When they entered the apartment, it was a gruesome scene. Catherine was already dead. Joseph was led on the bed next to her, barely clinging to life. He died within minutes of his brothers arriving. Once police arrived at the scene, they began looking for evidence, and it wouldn't take them long. They found a pile of blood-soaked clothes that on its own shows how unhinged the Axeman must have been. 2 different weapons to try and hide the cause of death, but then thinks it's a good idea to strip down and leave his clothes behind at the crime scene. Strange man. This isn't the only thing he left behind. Just outside of the apartment, they found the Maggio's blood-soaked axe. Oh, we have a Salem. You gonna say hi? Are you gonna sit and join us? Yeah. This is my co-host. This isn't the only thing he left behind. Just outside of the apartment, they found the Maggio's own blood-soaked axe, and only a few houses down, they found the razor. Even though it was a brutal attack, nothing in the apartment seemed to be askew or stolen, leading police to believe whoever had done this either did it just for the sake of killing, or that it was someone who would have benefited from the Maggio's deaths. The first place the police looked? Right next door at the victim's own family. The police were mostly focused on Andrew Maggio. He owned the local barber shop, which, if you could guess, meant he had access to a lot of razors. One of his employees claimed that a few days prior to the murders, he'd even seen Andrew take home one specific razor to sharpen, and as it just so happens, it was the same razor that was used in the attack. This isn't concrete evidence, however. If your brother was a barber, it's not far-fetched to think that you may borrow one of his razors to do a trim at home. Plus, he used the Maggio's own axe. What's to say he didn't just find the razor in the home as well? But there's still the fact that he claimed to not hear the attack, but could hear gurgling. This was also explained by Andrew. He went out drinking that night to celebrate being accepted into the Navy. By the time he got home, he was extremely intoxicated and ended up falling asleep. With the amount of alcohol in his system, it's no surprise that he didn't wake up during the attack next door. He had only heard the gurgling sounds coming from Joseph because he had woken up around 4:30 a.m. for a drink. The police could tell that there was no solid evidence against Andrew, so no arrest was made. It's worth mentioning that some sources say there was a note written in blood on a wall nearby that night. It said, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up late tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." And if you've guessed, we have no idea who Mrs. Tony is. But it is worth noting given what the killer goes on to do. Just 1 month later, on June 27th, 1918, the Axeman struck again. This time, his victims were Louis Bessemer and Harriet Lowe, his mistress. They lived behind Bessemer's grocery store. While they were sleeping, the Axeman snuck into their home, the same way he did before, using their own axe to strike them both in the head. Despite their severe injuries, both Louis and Harriet survived the initial attack. The morning came, and a delivery driver named John Zanker took his bread delivery to Bessemer's store. When he found that the store was still locked up, and that there was no reply to his knocks, he decided to go around to the side door to check. It was then that he heard movement inside, which relieved him, but then Bessemer opened the door, covered in blood. He told John that someone had attacked them both with an axe, and then pointed very shakily towards the bedroom. John went inside to go and look. This is when he saw Harriet laid on the bed, covered in blood. Zanker wanted to call the police, but Bessemer insisted that he call his private doctor instead. However, Zanker contacted the police and asked for an ambulance for both victims. The police found the same entry point as the Maggio murders, the panel chiselled out of the door, along with the blood-soaked axe found in the bathroom. Despite the fact that Bessemer was conscious, the only thing he could give police was that he couldn't remember the attack or the attacker. This was potentially due to Harriet's account of the attack. While she was in the hospital in and out of consciousness, the police had tried to question her. She first claimed that she was attacked by a mixed-raced man, and did use a slur, so safe to say the accusation was definitely racially motivated. And then she changed her mind and said that it was Louis, and that he was actually a German spy. She claimed that she had confronted him about it, and that he attacked her with an axe and then hit himself to cover it up. Sure, Harriet, sure he did. Police did look into this, as it was a serious accusation at the time, but other than a few letters in his home in a European language, there was no evidence, so they released him. Yes, they did actually arrest him for being a spy. Louis Bessemer would be the first survivor of the Axeman. Harriet, however, wasn't so lucky. After 7 weeks in hospital, she died from her injuries. When Bessemer got out of the hospital, he admitted that Harriet was not his wife, though he was living with her. He then asked to be assigned to investigate his own case. That made the police understandably suspicious, since Bessemer was a grocer, not a police officer. It became apparent that he wanted to keep something quiet. Police assumed that he did indeed cause the injuries to both of them, most likely due to some domestic dispute, and so he was arrested for murder, but it soon became clear that he was not the Axeman. 2 months after the Bessemer attack, on August 5th, the day that Harriet Lowe died, a businessman named Edward Schneider. I struggle with English. That is a tongue twister. You should try and say it fast. Edward Schneider. He returned home that evening, expecting to see his 28-year-old wife, Anna, greeting him at the door. They were expecting a baby. She was 8 months pregnant, and he wanted to be there to support her. Oh, that's nice. Not being sarcastic. However, when he opened the door to the home, it was quiet. Too quiet. He called for his wife, but heard no response. He was looking around with growing apprehension. He walked into the bedroom, and on the bed was his wife, covered in blood, with a gaping wound on her head and with teeth knocked out. Edward ran to her and discovered that somehow she was still alive. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but eventually regained consciousness. When asked what happened, she could not recall many details of the attack. She had been taking a nap and had been awoken to see a dark figure looming over her. And then the axe came down, and that's all she could remember. Miraculously, the attack didn't affect her pregnancy. She remained in the hospital and a week later gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Anna would now be the second known survivor, but even though there were many similarities between her attack and the previous ones, the police were still no closer to catching the infamous Axeman. 5 days after the Schneider attack, on August 10th, another woman was confronted by a dark figure inside her home. Pauline and Mary Bruno were awakened in the early hours of the morning to loud thumping noises that seemed to be coming from their Uncle Joseph's room. Pauline sat up in bed, and it was then that she saw a tall, dark figure right there in her room, standing over her bed. She understandably screamed, causing him to run from the home. She then bravely went into the room of her Uncle Joseph Romano. His nightshirt was covered in blood from wounds on his face. Sources say he said to her, "I don't know who did it," and with his last breath, collapsed on the floor. Upon investigating, police found that once again the bottom panel of the door had been chiselled out, and an axe was left in the garden. His total victims are now 4 dead, 2 survivors. 4 if you count Romano's nieces. As the months passed, there was an eerie silence. No more attacks were reported, and many hoped the Axeman's reign of terror had come to an end. But on March 13th, 1919, the Axeman re-emerged, not with another killing, but with a letter. This letter was sent to the local newspapers, and it caused panic throughout the city. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible. Even as the ether that surrounds your earth, I am not a human being, but a spirit, a demon from the hottest hell. But what was said next sent the entire city into a panic. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home is a jazz band in full swing at that time I have mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. He wanted a reaction from the public, and a reaction he got. The following Tuesday night, on March 19th, 1919, also, all the 19s, I've only just realised that. The following Tuesday night, on March 19th, 1919, pretty much every home with a record player was blasting jazz music. If people didn't have a record player, they went out to the local jazz clubs or to community centres. Every jazz band in New Orleans was booked. There were people who thought the letter could have been a hoax, but they were not willing to risk that chance. And that night, and for months after, there were no more attacks. Just days before the infamous letter was sent, the Axeman had already claimed more victims. On March 10th, 1919, Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia, oh my god, I actually managed to say a word. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia were attacked in their home in Gretna, Louisiana. The couple, along with their 2-year-old daughter Mary, was sleeping when the Axeman broke into their home. Charles and Rosie survived the attack, although they were severely injured. Tragically, their young daughter Mary was not so fortunate. The murder of such a young child sent shockwaves through the community. When Rosie had recovered from her injuries, she was ready with an accusation. Orlando Giordano and his son Frank. I don't know what it is with all of these really difficult names. I swear people have it in for me. Orlando Giordano and his son Frank were who she decided to blame, despite the fact that they'd actually rushed over to help her after the attack. Frank was said to be a big-built man, so it doesn't seem that he would be likely even able to fit through the small panels in the doors that the Axeman used to gain entry to people's homes, and his elderly father was ill and weak. It's unlikely he could even lift an axe, let alone swing one. Unfortunately, the police didn't agree, and they were both arrested and charged for murder. Rosie's testimony against the two men at their trial was so persuasive that they were both convicted. One witness said that Rosie had claimed that directly after the attack that it was actually her husband Charles, but it was all too late. The elderly neighbour was sentenced to life in prison, and his son Frank was sentenced to death. It was around this time that Louis Bessemer went on trial. Now that the war was over, no one really cared if he was a spy or not. The coroner testified that only a man much stronger than Bessemer could have inflicted on himself the wounds that Bessemer had, and so it took the jury only 10 minutes to acquit him of the murder of Harriet Lowe. And to add another twist, after the trial, Charles filed for divorce from Rosie. It was this reality check that likely caused her to come clean and admit that she had made the entire story up, meaning Frank and his father were innocent. Well done, we knew that already. Other sources say she was threatened by one of the local jailers that she would be given life in prison if she did not identify the Giordanos. Luckily, in their retrial on December 6, 1920, they were both acquitted and released from jail. The Axeman's final known victim was Mike Peppertone. I swear these names, they're trying to make my life difficult. The Axeman's final known victim was Mike Peppertone, another Italian grocer, who was murdered in his home on the night of October 27, 1919. Peppertone's wife, who had been sleeping in another room, was awakened by the sounds of a struggle. She found her husband with his head crushed by an axe, and she was claimed to have seen the man fleeing from the scene. However, she could not identify the killer. This would be the last attack definitively linked to the Axeman. After the murder of Mike Peppertone, the Axeman seemed to vanish. The police were left with more questions than answers. Over the course of a year, at least 6 people were murdered and many were brutally attacked by this elusive killer. So who was the infamous Axeman of New Orleans? One popular theory is that the Axeman killings were tied to organised crime. According to this theory, the Axeman was either a hitman or someone enforcing mafia interests by killing those who didn't comply with extortion demands. Another theory is that the Axeman wasn't a single individual, but a group of people or a copycat situation. This theory raises the possibility that a mix of unrelated crimes were attributed to the same person, or that it was several individuals that were using the same MO for their own reasons. Some investigators and theorists have drawn comparisons between the Axeman of New Orleans and Jack the Ripper. Both killers were never caught. Both sent taunting letters to the media, although there is no concrete evidence linking the two. Some have speculated that the Axeman could have actually been inspired by Jack the Ripper. One of the more specific suspects named over the years is Joseph Mumfree, a Yes, he's a pretty criminal. A petty criminal in New Orleans. This theory came to light after the murder of Mike Peppertone. His widow, Esther, I love that name, Esther, very, very old-fashioned. His widow, Esther, later claimed that Mumfrey had been involved in her husband's death and that he had extorted money from the family before the murder. According to this story, Esther later shot and killed Mumfrey in Los Angeles in 1921. I can't imagine an Esther with a gun. That's going to be a mental image I won't be able to get rid of for a minute. While her story gained some attention, there is little concrete evidence linking Mumfrey to the Axeman killings. Despite the extensive investigation and media attention at the time, the identity of the Axeman remains a mystery. So, what do you think the most likely theory is? Make sure to let me know down in the comments. I always want to hear your thoughts and opinions. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. It's the best way to help support me. And yeah, until next time, stay safe and stay spooky. Bye.